He just went out and confessed it. This bombshell confession is one of the most important things you will hear. It will alter the way you understand the world, not least your understanding of seismic global events. It's a confession from the Defence Minister of Pakistan, Khawaja Asif. Pakistan, of course, is a key ally of the United States, which was particularly important during the Cold War struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. And what you're going to hear concerns the US support, arming and funding of Islamist terrorist extremists and what became known as the War on Terror. This is an interview on Sky News. Let's listen to what he says.
The things cooled down then, and now again the same thing is...
You do admit, sir, that Pakistan has had a long history of backing and supporting and training and funding these terrorist organizations.
Well, we have been doing this dirty work for the United States for about 3 decades, and West, including Britain.
So that's your argument that even though...
No, that was a mistake, and we suffered for that. And that is why you are saying this to me. If we had not joined the war against Soviet Union and later on the war after 9/11, this Pakistan's track record, was not, unimpeachable track record.
Defence Minister, I just want to get back to this particular incident.
Okay, a bit of context here. There are growing tensions between India and Pakistan. There's a long history here, of course, between the two nuclear-armed neighbours who have fought 3 wars in the past. The trigger was the massacre of Indian tourists in Kashmir on Tuesday, with the Islamist extremist group Lashkar-e-Taiba to blame. This is a part of India, Kashmir, as things stand, but India has brutally suppressed a struggle for national self-determination. Kashmir is overwhelmingly Muslim. India, which is under the rule of Hindu nationalists, has blamed Pakistan for supporting terrorism. Indian and Pakistani troops have exchanged fire over the line of control in Kashmir. India has revoked its water treaty with Pakistan, told its citizens to leave that country. Pakistan has expelled Indian diplomats and closed its airspace to Indian aircraft. There were other dynamics at play, China backing Pakistan. We could go on. Now, let me just repeat the key element of that interview. The Sky News interviewer said, but do you admit, sir, that Pakistan has had a long history of backing and supporting and training and funding these terrorist organizations? And then Pakistan's defense minister says, well, we have been doing this dirty work for the United States for 3 decades. The interviewer is clearly stunned by this confession, but then the defense minister also notes it wasn't just dirty work for the US, but also Britain. He refers back to the war against the Soviet Union, which was, of course, the Western-backed jihad against Soviet troops in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Let's do a little bit of a rewind here. This is an important history lesson for us all. After World War II, Afghanistan, which bordered the Soviet Union, was one of many battlegrounds between the Soviets and the West. Both tried competing for its attention under the then Afghan king, but Pakistan and Afghanistan had a border dispute that deterred the US from giving Afghanistan military aid, for example, because the US was close to Pakistan. So Afghanistan increasingly looked to the Soviets. In 1973, while the king was out of the country for an eye operation, his cousin overthrew him in a coup d'etat. Oof. At this time, Islamists and communists were competing for support in Kabul, in particular. Clearly, the communists looked to the Soviet Union, whilst Islamists got the support of the Pakistani secret services, the Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI. The new government had the support of communists, but increasingly began turning away from them and the Soviet Union. The communists are not happy. In 1978, after an attempt to take on the communists, that regime gets overthrown by the Communist Party. Now, the new regime tries to do what many of us would say are good things, like land reform and women's rights. That enrages the Islamists. But it was also extremely brutal and disrespectful towards those with religious faith, and indeed committed terrible atrocities, including rounding up religious leaders. Now, the Soviet defenders or patrons of this regime got more and more despairing about their supposed allies, who they saw as too extreme, dogmatic and incompetent, whilst an Islamist insurgency was gaining ground. The Soviets feared Afghanistan would defect to the Western sphere of influence, and they also feared a hostile Islamist regime on their borders, which could stir up Muslim citizens in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, at the time, US power was in crisis, not least because it just got thrashed in Vietnam at huge economic cost, as well as losing tens of thousands of American soldiers, leaving US power looking enfeebled. The US elite see an opportunity here. We were shattered by the Vietnam War, but what if we could do the same to the Soviet Union? Now, 6 months before the Soviets actually invaded, Jimmy Carter, the then president, Democratic president, signed something called a presidential finding that authorized hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of support to Afghan insurgents. That proved a modest down payment in what became known as Operation Cyclone. Under Carter's Republican successor, Ronald Reagan, $470 million was allocated to the rebels in 1986 alone, rising to $630 million in 1987. That's in current dollars, about $1.37 billion and then another $1.9 billion. Now, the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter was a Polish-born guy called Zbigniew Brzezinski, and many years later, he was very candid about US intentions. He told a French journalist that the US didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we know increasingly increased the probability they would. He was asked whether he regretted what the US had done, and his answer was instructive. Regret what? That secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap, and you want me to regret it? For almost a decade, Brzezinski noted, the Soviets had to carry on a war that was unsustainable for the regime, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally the breakup of the Soviet Empire. When his interviewer then put it to him that the US administration had supported Islamic fundamentalism, which has given arms and advice to future terrorists, Brzezinski was highly dismissive. What is more important in world history, he said, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire, some agitated Muslims, or the liberation of Central Europe at the end of the Cold War? In another interview, Brzezinski declared the intention had been to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long as is possible. But here's the thing. The US needed plausible deniability. It didn't think it could just openly hand over arms and money to the Islamist fighters in Afghanistan. So instead it made a pact with Pakistan, which was then ruled by a military dictator named Zia al-Haq. This dictator was very committed to a form of Islamism. The pact went like this. The US would funnel money and arms, kept secret, incidentally, from the US public, to these Islamist rebels, but it would do so at arm's length, handing it all over to the Pakistani secret services, the ISI. And what the ISI did is make sure that those arms and funds went to the most extreme Islamists who were fighting, who it also believed the ISI would serve Pakistan's desire to expand its own influence. The US knew exactly who its arms and money were going to. It knew their attitudes towards women. It knew the sorts of atrocities they were committing. It also believed the Islamists were the best fighters because the more moderate forces, like monarchists, lacked the same devotion and willingness to fight to the death. Here's the other thing. These jihadis, many of them were very open about the fact that when they'd finished taking on the Soviet Union, they were going to shift their attention to the US. They said it out loud. The US knew that, but they didn't take it seriously because they thought, well, what's going to happen? It's only Afghanistan. It's halfway across the world, landlocked. You know, it's crucially on the Soviet border. It's not bordering us. Why is it ever going to blow up in our faces? Not like we'd ever do anything stupid like occupy Afghanistan, is it? Reagan, other US politicians and the CIA laud these jihadists as freedom fighters. Now, crucially, it wasn't just Afghans fighting. From across the world, these jihadists came to fight, including from the Arab world. And they received crucial training in urban warfare, which they could then take elsewhere. One of those was Osama bin Laden, the 17th son of a Saudi businessman who played a crucial role in literally building Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden was very close at the time to the Saudi regime, themselves close allies of the US, and they matched the Saudis, the funding of the US dollar for dollar, also going to the most extreme groups in Afghanistan. Contrary to myth, bin Laden wasn't directly funded or trained by the CIA, from what we know, but US officials thought he was a good thing, and many of his associates were funded and trained by the CIA. What's also true is that some of the jihadi leaders being armed and funded by the US made clear that when they defeated the Soviets, as I've said, next, the US. Now, this is fascinating, isn't it, in terms of how this all panned out in the end. Because the long story short is Western support for the jihadis was more successful than anticipated. Thousands of Soviet troops killed at huge economic cost to the Soviet Union. When Mikhail Gorbachev becomes Soviet leader in 1985, he calls the Soviet occupation a bleeding wound and says the Soviet intention is to withdraw. The damage inflicted on the Soviets played a very significant role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Brzezinski was correct. And when the Soviets withdrew and the Cold War was over, US funding and arms still made their way to jihadis. Still then, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, the West lost interest, having helped raise an armed Islamist fundamentalist movement all over the world. Now, the Western-backed jihadis took over Afghanistan, but then they fell out with each other badly, leading to apocalyptic carnage, really hideous. Kabul razed. Really just the most hideous atrocities imaginable. In this context, there was another important development. The Pakistani dictatorship had funded madrasas, or so-called religious schools, that helped radicalize both Pakistani citizens but also Afghan refugees. Money from the US's Saudi allies was also plowed into those madrasas, with the Saudis also interested in promoting the most radical interpretation of Islam. And those radicalized there included the future leaders of what became known as the Taliban, which means students. With the Western-backed jihadis associated with hideous carnage, the Taliban swept about 1996, winning support for many Afghans on the grounds that they would restore order, end the carnage. And the Taliban were backed by, guess who? That's right, US ally, Pakistan's secret services. Bin Laden had by now fallen out with his former allies in the Saudi leadership because they'd hosted particularly Western troops after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. His citizenship was stripped. He ended up in Sudan. They kicked him out. He ended up in Afghanistan. As it happens, not at the invite of the Taliban, but his old Mujahideen allies, the Western-backed ones, who he was close to. He had a complicated relationship with the Taliban, who were also being wooed by a US oil company, Unocal, to build a pipeline in Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban didn't have global ambitions, unlike bin Laden. He wanted a global Islamist uprising as he saw it. They increasingly saw him as a nightmarish guest who they struggled to control. They ended up finding out about 9/11 when the rest of us did. 9/11, of course, mostly executed by citizens of Saudi Arabia, the West ally. None of them were Afghan. Now, bin Laden's plan with 9/11 was to draw the US into occupying Afghanistan in the hope they would end up being defeated there like the Soviets, with devastating consequences for US power. Guess what the US did? Exactly what he wanted them to, with exactly the result he intended. And with the so-called war on terror, Al-Qaeda became much bigger, more powerful, much more deadly, and indeed they ended up creating a much more extreme offshoot, ISIS. But all of this rebounded on Pakistani society as these fattened up Islamist groups became more powerful there. They created a monster that began to devour them. And meanwhile, a large chunk of Pakistan's secret services supported the Taliban in their insurgency against US troops. That's Pakistan, the West ally. There's your potted history, how US power used Islamist fundamentalism to help destroy the Soviet Union, which then badly rebounded on the US, with shattering consequences for US power. Now, I've got a book, I should confess, called The Fall of the West, which hopefully will be out next year. So as you can see, I'm doing a lot of research. But yes, this confession from Pakistan's defense minister is so important because it helps teach a lesson that Western leaders and media outlets would rather we forget. Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts in your comments, help us take on the terrible pro-genocide, awful, terrible car crash media, patreon.com/Owen84. Like, subscribe, leave your comments, get some more people sharing, talking. Listen to the podcast, speak to you soon.